It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Edward Kelly, who is a professor in the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. And we're very pleased that Ed can be here because he has spent many years, along with others, but he's sort of the, I don't know what it is, the cat herder of your Esalen group, Ed, that has looked in a scholarly and deep and rigorous manner into the question of, should we abandon this mainstream view of physicalism, which we willingly or not are born into in our culture? And in particular, you should all be aware of the triple of books that he has motivated and edited and brought into being. So there's the book, I think this is coming out backwards, unfortunately. I don't know why that is, a mirror image. But Irreducible Mind, which is a large volume, fascinating reading, examining the different capacities of consciousness and mind, including psi. And then they address more directly with Beyond Physicalism, which came out, I believe, in 2015, the whole question of whether physicalism needs to be abandoned. And more recently, Consciousness Unbound, which looks at different ways of going beyond physicalism. So with that introduction, Ed, please.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks for inviting me. This has been really interesting so far. Now, I aspire to kind of convey to our audience the main features of those three books, but of course, altogether, that's almost 2,000 pages of material, and I'm told 25 minutes, so it's going to have to be a bit telegraphic here and there. We may be able to pursue some of the finer points in discussion. Let me just start by way of orientation by saying that there are two primary takeaways I would like the audience to get from this talk. The first is that the currently dominant science-based theory of reality, physicalism, is inadequate to the task and must be abandoned in favor of some expanded science-based theory that can accommodate additional kinds of human capacities, including, in particular, things like psi phenomena, the various kinds of psi phenomena, genius, and spiritual and mystical experiences. Secondly, that even though we're nowhere close to a full consensus on what such a theory might be, I do think we've begun to see in broad outline what it may look like. And I hope to get to that toward the end of the talk. So before I launch on the substance, let me also mention that echoing really Peter and Chris and a couple of other points along the way, the early stalwarts of psychical research were very interested in theory and repeatedly pointed out the need. I mean, even though we need lots more and better facts, we need more than just facts. A heap of facts is not going to be sufficient to persuade the scientific community that we're doing needs to be taken seriously. And in fact, I'm one of the people certainly who thinks that probably advances in theory at this point would do more than anything else to encourage acceptance of psi phenomena by the scientific community at large. You know, Henry Sidgwick, in his first address to the SPR in 1882, talked about how it was a scandal that the scientific world had not yet come to a decision about the reality of psychic phenomena. We're still in that condition today. Anyway, let me leave it at that. So, physicalism, what is that? Well, it's not one absolutely clearly defined thing. It's a family of related positions. But the form that has captured the most attention goes roughly like this in all the different flavors. All facts are determined in the end by physical facts alone. That's because reality consists at bottom of some kind of ultimate material stuff, little bits of stuff, insentient, self-existent, depending on nothing else, moving around in accordance with mathematical laws under the influence of fields of force. Everything else has to be built from that basic stuff, whatever it is. We, human beings, are nothing but immensely complicated biochemical machines. Nothing gets into us from the environment except by way of our sensory surfaces. Nothing gets out of us and into the environment except by way of our motor systems, including speech and so on. Everything in mind and consciousness, and yes, even consciousness itself, is generated by neurophysiological events and processes going on in our brains. And since that's the way it is, when we die, mind and consciousness necessarily cease. There cannot be any form of postmortem survival. Period. Lights out. On a bigger scale, we don't see any evidence of any kind of teleological influences on evolution, and we see no sign of any kind of transcendental order. As physicist Steven Weinberg notoriously said in his book on dreams of a final theory in physics, the better we get to know the universe, the more it seems pointless. Well, that's a pretty bleak picture. I think we'd all agree. Could be true, of course. Well, is it? My colleagues and I definitely do not think so. And that's what I want to talk to you about next. For starters, this doctrine, and let me say first that, this is the kind of received wisdom of most of the kind of scientists that I have dealings with. That means biologists, neuroscientists, psychologists, and others in the behavioral sciences, and an occasional philosopher of mind. It's also penetrated the humanities very deeply, including even disciplines such as religious studies, remarkably enough. And it's the received wisdom of opinion elites worldwide. It's remarkable what a grip it has gotten on our culture. But note that first that it is anchored, or you might say chained to, the classical physics of the late 19th century. It had reached a high state of development at that point over several centuries, could explain lots and lots of very subtle things. It's an astonishing achievement. Let's not belittle it. And yet, physics itself has, as we know, already moved far beyond the concepts that were at work there. And William James, as early as the Principles of Psychology, or its later abridged version, was talking about how these principles are provisional and perhaps revisable things. He was anticipating what was to come, meaning stuff like quantum theory and relativity, which unfortunately he didn't live to see. But those things have really created a seismic shift in the foundations of physics, which hasn't quite penetrated to the sort of narrow scientific mainstream that I was talking about. For people like me who know vaguely about it, that stuff all depends on things that are at scales too remote from everyday life, too big, too small, too fast, too slow for us to kind of take them in very well. One person who did take these things in right away was Alfred North Whitehead, who early in the 20th century began to elaborate a different kind of metaphysical scheme that attempted to take account of these new developments in physics. And I think we're really just kind of getting back to that now. Another area that's been complementary to ours is philosophy of mind. And I think it's fair to say at this point that many philosophers of mind, including in particular lots of the rising generation, have become convinced, along with David Chalmers, that there is no way to explain consciousness in physicalist terms. So that's part of the background. Now, the work that I want to tell you about, though, the work that my Esalen group and I have carried out, is really concerned more with kind of basic human psychophysical capacities of one sort or another. And before I start explaining what we did, I need to say a bit about the kind of underlying background of the problem. Everybody agrees that there are strong correlations normally between mental things and physical things. Brain and mind clearly are working closely together in some way. If you get hit on the head hard enough, or drink too much alcohol, or ingest a psychedelic, or get an invasive brain tumor, things will change mentally, and sometimes in very peculiar and specific characteristic ways. So we can be absolutely sure that physical to mental causation is real. What about the other direction, mental to physical? Well, I get the idea of moving my hand, raising it, and it goes up in the air. That looks like mental causation. What does a physicalist say to that? Well, he says, you've misunderstood what's really going on, because you see that idea or impulse that you formed is really nothing more than a pattern of electrical activity in your brain, and that's what caused your arm to go up, ultimately. Physical causes physical, no problem. Well, that's a very glib argument, but it's also quite difficult to disprove. And the basic way of, or the most direct way of attacking it, is to find things that cannot possibly be done by an unaided brain. So this group that we formed out at Esalen, I should say a little bit by way of background. Mike Murphy, the co-founder of Esalen, has a thing called Center for Theory and Research. It's a kind of think tank within Esalen, through which he can pursue his numerous intellectual interests. He knows a good bit about parapsychology, and he was aware, this is in 1998, that if physicalism is true, there cannot be survival, period. But there are people here and there on the planet who are doing research, purports to be developing evidence suggestive of the possibility of survival. That includes, for example, some of my colleagues at DOPS, the Division of Perceptual Studies, little research unit within the psychiatry department, UVA. Bruce Grayson works on near-death experiences, Jim Tucker on cases of the reincarnation type, the work started by Ian Stevenson, our founder. So Mike convened a group of us, and we began to present some of this evidence and talk about it. But after two of our annual meetings, we hatched a scheme to launch an all-out attack on physicalism, since we were all clearly opposed to it. And it would have two parts. The first part being to try to collect in one place a lot of the kinds of evidence of the type I just indicated that are difficult or impossible to explain in physicalist terms. And then if we could get through that part, we would go on to try to, the much more difficult part really, of imagining how the world must really be if things of those sorts can happen in it. So for the first part, we kind of model ourselves after a great book by Frederick Myers, published in 1903, called Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. If only he hadn't used that subtitle, the book would probably be much better known today than it is. It's a fantastic one-man piece of work. So we revisited a lot of the topics that Myers presented and discussed in light of the following century of biomedical research, in an attempt to kind of evaluate a model of personality that he advanced. He was assisted in that by his friend and colleague, William James. And as I'll describe in a few moments, James really took Myers' model and expanded it in a more philosophical kind of direction, which is where we get to at the end of this 3-book project. So First on any such list of things that can't be done by unaided brains, of course, is the various kinds of psi phenomena, possibly including survival. Uh, the conflict with conventional physicalism is clear and obvious. That's what makes these things interesting to those of us who are open to the possibility of change, and what makes the whole subjects anathema to those for whom physicalism has become a kind of a secular faith. And there are plenty of those, we can be sure. We don't have to resolve the long-standing controversy regarding survival evidence, that is, whether it really demonstrates survival or could all be explained by psi-type interactions among living persons or living persons in their environments. Because both horns of that explanatory dilemma are fatal to physicalism. Now, lots of physicalists would like to think that, well, okay, we have trouble with these psi phenomena, but this is kind of a crazy little subject. Why don't we just wall it up in a room, quarantine the subject, and everything else will be just dandy? Well, it's not that simple, because there are plenty of other things, including consciousness, as David Chalmers and others have argued, that are not readily explained in physicalist terms. And our first book, which took us about 5 years to finish writing, way more than we expected, catalogs a bunch of things, and I'll just enumerate them rather than saying much of anything about them. First concerns various kinds of extreme psychophysical phenomena, not general influences on body processes, but things that get increasingly specific and localized and difficult to explain as the chapter goes on. This was written by my wife, Emily. And includes things like stigmata, for example, hypnotic blisters, extraordinary pain control, and in the worst case, when the effects occur not on one's own body, but on somebody else's, as, for example, what are called maternal depression cases, where a pregnant woman sees some ghastly scene and that gets reflected. For example, somebody loses a limb or something, and that's reflected in the child subsequently born. And there's about 100 of these cases in the medical literature. There's then a chapter by Alan Gauld, a stalwart of the SPR, on memory. It's probably the most difficult chapter in Irreducible Mind, and it overlaps a good bit in content with the kind of discussions that have taken place about consciousness, same kinds of properties of the human memory system that Alan finds impossible to explain. Then we have a chapter that's very important from the theoretical point of view by Adam Crabtree about psychological automatisms and secondary centers of consciousness. And in particular, let me say, cases of the latter type in which the normally hidden personality is far more able than the everyday personality. And the best documented of these cases show some very curious features. For example, the secondary personality B may overlap with A in the sense that it knows a lot about what A is doing, but not vice versa, and have far more ability and knowledge even than A. Different alters, as they're called, can sometimes have different profiles of allergies and need different prescriptions for their glasses and that sort of thing. A very curious business. And this became the cornerstone of Myers's conception. And I should say more about this right now. Most contemporary theorists think that everyday consciousness is all the consciousness there is in any one organism. There's everyday consciousness supported by various sorts of unconscious processes, maybe reflecting nothing more than the aspects of brain activity that don't make it to consciousness. Myers and James had a quite different idea. Myers specifically posits that in many of us, perhaps all of us, there is a larger consciousness with what he calls adits and operations of its own, by which he meant some of these kind of superior mental abilities, including psi abilities. And I do think of psi in terms of abilities, access to information and action that the everyday consciousness does not normally have access to. And James will build upon that, as I'll describe in a moment, in his late philosophical work. Next chapter may be the most important, I think, empirically of the book, and it's about near-death experiences. And that's a big subject, of course. And let me just say that for me, the most significant part of that large body of material is the part involving near-death experiences that occur in extreme physiological circumstances, such as deep general anesthesia and or cardiac arrest. Because in those situations, the conditions regarded by virtually all neuroscientists as required for the occurrence of conscious experience have been abolished, or at least very severely degraded. And yet people are reporting not only conscious experiences of some sort, but the most intense and transformative experiences of their entire lives. I mean, I tend to think about deep NDEs as mystical experiences occurring under less than optimal conditions where you almost have to die in order to have the experience. There are two more chapters in Irreducible Mind that I'll say almost nothing about. They're on genius and mystical experience, respectively. These are two areas of psychology that are very undeveloped, particularly the latter. But I and most of the members of our group came to believe that mystical experience may be the real key to the whole theory business, in the sense that they seem to reveal normally hidden aspects of reality. And I hope to come back to this in the context maybe of a conversation with Tim Eastman later on, because I think we're sort of getting to the same territory from very different directions. A good place to look for the detailed arguments about this, by the way, is in the books by my co-editor, Paul Marshall, and in particular in Beyond Physicalism, our second book. He's got a chapter on this specific subject with a big supplement on the Esalen website. Okay, so that's the basic content of Irreducible Mind. For me, as a psychologist, the main impact was to convince me that the Myers-James picture of the mind-brain relation really is viable, even after another century of work. It pictures the mind and the brain as at least functionally distinct, if not ontologically distinct. Myers was probably an interactive dualist of a classical sort. C.D. Broad wrote a big essay about, or was writing a big essay about that at the time that he died. James, however, took the subject in a different direction that I'll get to in a moment. Beyond Physicalism. Now, let me just say just a little bit about that. We milled around again for a couple of years before we decided how to proceed. The question now is, how must reality actually be constituted in order that the kinds of rogue phenomena cataloged in Irreducible Mind and a lot of other places can happen? And what we settled on was to look at a variety of old and new conceptual frameworks or theories or metaphysical schemes that took the existence of such phenomena seriously and tried to address that question, to sketch a different picture of how the whole thing works. So in Beyond Physicalism, we had about a dozen of them. They included three contemporary physical schemes by physicists, including Harold Ottmansbacher, who represents the dual aspect monism that Marcus Meyer was referring to. Bernard Carr, who is a cosmologist from the point of view of relativity and string theory, and Henry Stapp, a quantum theorist, who had previously developed a quite elaborate story about how to account for mind-brain interaction, but is actually very sympathetic to the larger kinds of things that we end up with. We also visited a number of traditional mystically informed religious philosophies, for example, Neoplatonism and Plotinus, Patanjali and yoga, and the Kashmiri Shaivism of Abhinavagupta and others, and several Western philosophical traditions, including Leibniz, Whitehead, and Charles Sanders Peirce. And in the last part of Beyond Physicalism, we made a first attempt to try to identify these sort of common principles that may unite these very diverse frameworks that we had visited in some detail in the earlier parts of the book. And I took responsibility for that, drawing heavily on comments and discussions with the other contributors. And I pitched it in terms of the late work of William James. This is in the last part of chapter 14 of Beyond Physicalism, retracing James's trajectory. You know, James had introduced this idea of what's now called the filter or transmission theory, in which mind and brain are functionally distinct, normally work together, but the brain can be thought of as sort of channeling or focusing or sharpening influences received from a functionally distinctive mental something. And he didn't talk very much about the character of that something. Could be anything from an individual psyche to a world soul or something of that sort. But he hinted and he talked, in a long footnote, he explains he's talking in kind of conventional dualist terms, but he thinks it might be possible to get beyond this later on. Then comes Varieties of Religious Experience. This is 1902, I guess, or 3. And at the end of, in the philosophy chapter of that book, he talks about how the general drift of all mystical experience is towards some kind of idealism. He was one of the early generalists about mystical experience, followed later on by people like Walter Stace and Aldous Huxley, who were impressed by the commonalities among the world's mystical traditions. At the end of Varieties, James hints that he's working toward an elaboration of Myers's model. And by the way, most people don't notice this, would have no reason to, but James says repeatedly in VRE that he is using Myers's model to explain all these different kinds of religious experiences. And he accepts that basic picture that I sketched earlier, in which there's not only everyday consciousness and unconscious cerebration, but some sort of larger consciousness lurking behind. It's unconscious only in the sense that the everyday consciousness cannot access it normally. But part of what James was anxious to show in VRE is that people can somehow, on some occasions, get themselves into states wherein these normally hidden aspects of consciousness can begin to reveal themselves in everyday conscious life. Now, if that filter transmission picture is correct, it solves what for me had always been a real obstacle to taking survival seriously. Because if mind and consciousness are not manufactured by the brain, but simply conditioned or shaped by it, then the possibility of survival, or the logical impossibility, the logical obstacle to survival, is reduced or removed. Now, here's what happens in the last part of chapter 14 and Beyond Physicals. Here's what happened to James. In his late work, Essays in Radical Empiricism, and especially in a book called A Pluralistic Universe, he generalizes Myers's basic picture to one in which there are, we don't know how many, but successively higher levels of integration of consciousness beyond that of the everyday consciousness. How far up they go, not so clear. These lectures took place in the context of sort of a last heyday of idealism in England. It had been in Germany before that, and it was still the idealism, absolute idealism in various forms, was the reigning philosophical position of that time. James actually hated it, and he wants to present a different view, which nevertheless has a good deal in common. There is some kind of a highest level of integration, but it's not an absolute that incorporates everything. It's got its own sort of external environment of some kind, and we can't blame it for things like the problem of evil. It can also be a little bit more like us so that we can have a kind of intimacy with us, with it. So these are things that James hoped to achieve with his particular form of pluralism. And at the end of this chapter, I present what appears to be the most common tendency among our entire group of people contributing to this theory conversation, which is that what we seem to be getting toward is a position called evolutionary panentheism. And just very briefly, panentheism kind of splits the difference between traditional theisms and pantheisms. Theism, is the typical monotheistic God standing apart from the creation, either creating it and messing with it thereafter, or creating it and just letting it go on as best it can. Pantheism, often identified with Spinoza, maybe improperly, the divine is equivalent to the entirety of creation. In panentheism, the divine is included within all of creation, but there's something left over, a bit in the same sort of a relation that we occupy to our bodies.